Yeah. Okay. So there's something we could talk about for a minute because, there's there's political, what do you call, rumblings about the fact that I think a lot of this is generated by the radical left types, particularly on the campuses, that the system is rigged and that it's an oppressive patriarchy and that the reason that people are at the top is because they played power games. And, it's this, my sense is that the construal is that we're ethnic or racial or gendered groups and we're competing in the Marxist manner, and those who win have won because of oppression. But I know the literature on the relationship between individual differences and long-term life success in the Western world, and the literature is actually very clear. So intelligence seems to account for about 20% of the variance in long-term life success. And then trait conscientiousness accounts for perhaps another maybe 10 to 15%. And then there's smaller contributions of emotional stability and also of trait openness, which seems to be a good predictor of entrepreneurial ability. So it looks like in the West that you can attribute about 40 to 50% of the variance. Maybe that's a little high, but it's not a radical overestimate to the sorts of individual differences that are associated with productivity, because increases in IQ, and higher conscientiousness definitely make people more productive. It seems to me that you can use that as an index of the genuinely meritocratic nature of a culture, and also as an index of its willingness to engage in fair play, because you'd expect if your culture is aimed at productivity, and it turns out that the most productive people are in fact differentially rewarded, that seems to me to be a reasonable index of the success of the society. Now, that data still leaves 50 to 60% of the variance unexplained, and so you could include racism and prejudice and the tyranny of the system and blind luck and physical health and all the arbitrary and random events that determine whether someone is successful or fails in life. But it does seem to me to provide a metric saying that not only is our society crazily productive and reasonably good at distributing the spoils, even though there's still some inequality, but that a fair bit of the inequality is actually generated as a consequence of differences in genuine productivity. Does that seem reasonable to you?
Yeah, I mean, it ought to be obvious and banal, except for the fact that in a lot of intellectual life, the assumption is that the correlation between psychological traits and success is zero. So the fact that it's, let's say it's 40%, let's even say it's 33%. That's a lot higher than most people are willing to acknowledge. And what you said is exactly right. That leaves more than half of the variance not to be correlated with individual differences. And of course, various inequities could go into that 50 or 60%. And they're not mutually exclusive. It seems hard. We know that there's a lot of gaming of the system, particularly in the United States, by the wealthy. And that should obviously be eliminated. It's not meritocratic, it's not fair, it's not productive. One could also ask another question is whether the rewards that go to the talented are necessarily in sectors that lead to what we might call productivity in the sense of increasing societal wealth. And an argument can be made that there's some misallocation of intellectual resources, that we have, that the economy is too driven by finance, that there are too many lawsuits, the legal system is to each other, and so underestimated by intellectuals. This does still leave a place for criticizing a number of the ways in which our economy is set up. There's always scope for improvement.
Yes, and we were talking about why, despite the fact that a fair bit of the variance, or a third to a half of the variance in life success is taken up by, let's say, individual attributes, there's still room for a systemic critique that's valid.
Yeah, one of the pathologies of intellectual life that I wrote about in The Blank Slate, about the denial of human nature, was that in polite company, in intellectual circles, the amount of life success determined by inherent and largely heritable psychological traits has to be zero. I mean, that's just the only acceptable position, and you and I know it's not zero.
Well, also, just let me interject for one sec. There's a fairness element there But the other thing is, it seems to me that that's extraordinarily self-serving of people too, because, if you get together with a group of Harvard professors, for example, it's pretty obvious that their innate intelligence is one of the factors that determine their success. And to deny the fact that heritable differences make a difference means perhaps to act as an avatar of a social justice orientation, but equally to deny the role of the benefits of chance in your own success, and to therefore lack a certain degree of humility that you might otherwise be required to have. So it's not all, and I'm not claiming that you were implying this at all, but it's not all in the service of higher social ideals that people deny the contribution of heritable components, for example, the birth lottery. So.
Whoops, we just, okay. Unfortunately, the video just froze. And after you said, I'm not saying you claimed this, you suddenly froze on the screen. So I wonder if you could just repeat after I'm not saying you're claiming this.
Sure. Well, it seems self-serving for people who are particularly bright, for example, to not be grateful for the fact that they won the genetic lottery in that manner, and insufficiently humble to not note the role of that arbitrary chance in determining their success. I mean, it's not like they don't deserve their success because of that, but claiming a certain degree of biological determinism doesn't necessarily make you a bad person, even though it can be read that way, because it makes you very sensitive to your own good fortune if you think it through carefully.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, successful people are the winners of at least 3 lotteries. One of them that you mentioned, of course, is the genetic lottery, the fact that some people were born with greater intelligence and conscientiousness and openness to experience. Another is that there's a second lottery in human development that is not strictly genetic, but it is, in a sense, constitutional or developmental. The fact that, I consider this one of the most profound discoveries in the history of psychology, that correlations between identical twins reared together are generally on the order of 0.5, and they share not only their genome, but the vast amount of their environments, their parents, their neighborhoods, their older sibs, their younger sibs, the number of books in the house, the number of guns in the house, number of TVs in the house. Yet they're not indistinguishable. Identical twins correlate quite highly, but nowhere near perfectly, which means that there is a second lottery that has to do either with just the way the brain congeals during development, which can't be specified down to the last synapse by the genes, and perhaps by chance life events, which might leave unpredictable traces that we can't document or systematically understand. And then, of course, there's the third lottery of what happens to you in your profession. Did you bet on the right sector? Did you happen to have a good relationship with the boss? Numerous.
Right. That's a matter of being in the right place at the right time.
In the right place at the right time. So all that having been said, and you're absolutely right, we have to acknowledge the non-zero role of hereditary temperament and talent, the non-zero role of chance, and that still leaves a big chunk of the variance that could be due to systemic features of the system that perhaps ought to be changed. There's just no doubt that the wealthy game the system, particularly in the United States, in a number of ways that don't work to the benefit of society at large. There are also aspects of the system that are perhaps fair but irrational. The fact that so much of our intellectual talent now gets sucked into finance. Now, of course, we do need a financial sector, and it's good that there are smart people in it. But having a lot of our brain power devoted to figuring out how to act on financial information a microsecond faster than one's competitors is probably not the best use of our society's intellectual capital. Likewise, there's no doubt that we have far too much brain power invested in the legal system, in corporations suing each other, in patent trolling, and in other not so productive uses.
Yeah, well, the funny thing is too, though, that there's an ineradicable amount of pathology in a system in some sense. I mean, one of the things that struck me quite hard, for example, is that if you look at the creativity curves across the lifespan, they match the criminality curves almost perfectly. And one of the things that made me think when I was doing that research was so that as young men become more antisocial, they also become more creative, even though those things might not be correlated, but they do map on top of one another. I was thinking in a society like the United States, which has a fair degree of criminality, but also a fair degree of creativity, we have no idea how loose the system has to be so that malfeasance can thrive, so that it can also be simultaneously loose enough so that creativity can thrive, right? Because you might think, if you were optimistic, that you could tighten up the system and get rid of the criminal behavior without adding a totalitarian layer to the system that would also simultaneously demolish, individual variability and creativity. Our models just aren't sophisticated enough to tease such things apart.
Well, I'm not so sure. I do agree with you. There's a certain amount of risk-taking or young men on the make that might underlie both criminality and productive creativity. But over the course of history, I think one of the accomplishments of civilization and indeed of enlightenment-driven progress is that we have managed to tease them apart. Just two examples are the fact that the rate of homicide plunged by a factor of about 35 from the Middle Ages to the 20th century. And that includes the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the Enlightenment, all of the advances of the 20th century. So just as people were not stabbing each other in bars over insults, they were also coming up with the theory of evolution and the atomic theory of matter. And then again, in the 1990s, when the rate of violent crime in the United States fell by half, and there were also declines in Canada, in Britain, other Western countries. This certainly was not a time of economic stagnation or technological.
No, fair enough. I guess then the question starts to become is, how in the world did those things get teased apart so that we are able to regulate antisocial behavior without simultaneously making things excessively rigid and regulated and totalitarian? We managed it. Maybe it's part of that same incremental process that you detailed out at the beginning of our talk.
So you've been an educator through the rise of the smartphone, and my question basically relates to procrastination and task delay, needless task delay specifically. And given the unprecedented level of distraction that we have in today's world, I just wanted to get your perspective from a psychological standpoint on, other than cleaning your damn room, what would you suggest to a student who's looking to overcome these things?
Well, I think with any, let's call it addictive process, I mean, email is powerfully addictive, right? Partly, it's a slot machine, and I mean that technically. So when you pull, that's a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, if I remember correctly. And it's very addictive because if you pull on the slot machine arm enough, you will win. And you never know which pull will reward you. And so not only is that addictive, it's very hard to extinguish that. And so email's like that because there's always something beckoning, and now and then it's a jackpot. And social media is like that because, people are posting interesting things. And so, well, how do you overcome an addictive process? And partly you do it by replacing it with something better, right? So when people study drug and alcohol use, they often make an elementary mistake, which is to try to figure out why people use drugs and alcohol. That's not a smart thing to wonder. We know why people use cocaine. Cocaine directly stimulates the systems that produce